this afternoon. I'm going to turn the microphone over to our Director of Community Thermal Networks, Donovan Gordon, who's going to get us kicked off, and then we'll get into the details.
Thank you, Sue. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, and welcome to the Large Scale Thermal Program webinar. But I also want to mention another key person, my supervisor, Patrick Oshai, who I believe is on this line as well, too, who really gave a lot of support and direction in developing the strategy for this program. So thank you, Patrick. I see the numbers clicking up. We're well over 100 plus attendees so far. So thank you very much for participating. And also thank you for those who participated in the previous program, PON 4614. This is the successor to that. So this will be an informative webinar. And I do now want to turn it over to Sue Doherty, our Senior Project Manager in the Community Thermal Networks team and the person managing this program. So Sue, take it away.
Thanks, Donovan. I'm actually going to turn my camera off to allow people to focus on the slides here. We'll start out with some housekeeping items. John, if you could advance to the next slide, please. So all attendees are currently on mute, and you'll stay muted throughout the duration of this webinar. As we proceed through the webinar, you can submit questions through the Q&A function at any time. The chat is disabled, and at the end of the slides, we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll also take those questions back and provide written answers and post the questions and answers on our Large Scale Thermal website, along with a recording of this webinar. So you'll be able to go back and review the webinar and the questions that were asked during it. Next slide. So during this webinar, we'll give some background on the objective of this program and the types of projects that it will support, as well as the proposer and project eligibility requirements. We'll talk about the documentation that's required to submit with a complete proposal. And then, like I said, we'll do some questions and answers at the end. Next slide, please. So what is large-scale thermal? In the context of this funding opportunity, PON 5614, a large-scale thermal system is a system that uses heat pumps and low-carbon thermal resources like the ground, surface water, wastewater, waste heat, or thermal energy storage to provide heating, cooling, and hot water to one or more buildings. So the types of projects that qualify for this program can be single building projects that use heat pumps in the low carbon thermal resources described above, or multiple building projects such as thermal energy networks where buildings are connected together with a distribution piping network, or multiple building projects where buildings are arranged in any configuration. So that could be standalone, or that could be some buildings connected together and some buildings standalone on a single property or contiguous properties. But the project, the system configuration that's selected and proposed should represent the optimal technical and economic solution for the building or the group of buildings that are being proposed. Next slide, please. So some examples of the benefits of large-scale systems are that they can present very high system efficiencies, either by sharing thermal energy between buildings, taking advantage of a low-temperature distribution network that's less susceptible to heat loss, and using locally available renewable electric energy and battery storage. By capturing heat from, they also can have very long, useful lives because underground infrastructure such as boreholes and distribution piping can last 50 or more years. They have improved economics because larger projects can leverage shared thermal infrastructure to reduce total thermal demand and improve project costs. They have potential for future system expansion, like thermal energy networks that can be implemented in phases and expanded over time to add more buildings and end users. These systems can be designed to be highly resilient by including multiple thermal resources that are integrated into the same system that improve system reliability and resiliency. For example, if one of those thermal resources were to be disrupted by an event. And they have reduced electric usage. For example, thermal energy networks, which take advantage of load diversity and shared thermal energy, use less electricity than if each building were to install heat pumps independently. Next slide, please. So although this funding opportunity doesn't exclusively fund thermal energy network projects, this is an example of the system components that would be included in a thermal energy network project that may be eligible for this PON. So this schematic shows three major sets of components. One would be the distribution piping loop, heat pumps that are connected to the system, and sources or sinks or the thermal resources such as geothermal, surface water, waste heat, wastewater, or thermal energy storage. Next slide, please. So generally, thermal energy networks are arranged in two configurations, either centralized or distributed. Centralized systems use heat pumps in a central plant and distribute heated and chilled water to the multiple buildings connected to the network, or distributed systems which have heat pumps in each building and low temperature ambient water is distributed to each building. And the heat pumps either increase the temperature or decrease the temperature depending on the thermal needs of each building. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background about how we got to this funding opportunity. As Donovan mentioned, there was a program that preceded PON 5614 called the Community Heat Pump Systems Program, and that program opportunity notice was 4614. Through that program, we had 10 funding rounds where we funded projects at over 50 project sites, and we funded 48 feasibility studies, 12 design projects, and 6 construction projects. And of the nearly 50 feasibility studies that we funded throughout New York State, the results of those studies demonstrated that there are many projects that are suitable to advance to design. Next slide. And this funding opportunity will help those feasibility studies to advance the design, those feasibility studies that demonstrated technical and economic feasibility. Through this funding opportunity, we are seeking projects that are highly replicable. So projects that represent buildings, campuses, or groups of buildings that represent many other project sites in New York State, and projects that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from heating, cooling, and hot water. Next slide. So this slide shows some desired attributes of projects for PON 5614. Those attributes are also reflected in the scoring criteria, which we'll cover in a subsequent slide, and which you can also find detailed in the solicitation documentation. But some high-level criteria that are outlined here are projects with high system efficiencies, projects that are resilient to current and future climate events, present good economics, as well as projects that address equity, such as those located in disadvantaged communities or that serve low-income housing, as well as projects that address how customers will be recruited and educated about connection to the system by providing customer engagement and protection plans. Next slide. So some examples of project sites that are potential candidates for this program include campuses like colleges, universities, or medical campuses, large multifamily complexes, large single or multiple commercial buildings, and multiple neighboring buildings located in a community. Next slide. $10 million is available through this solicitation, and that $10 million can be awarded to projects that represent either single or multiple buildings. And the size threshold for a project that includes multiple buildings is at least 250,000 square feet of conditioned space or more. And a single building project must have at least 150,000 square feet of conditioned space or more. And this program supports both existing building projects and new construction. The maximum funding award per project for existing building retrofit projects is up to $500,000, and the maximum project award for projects with new construction buildings is up to $300,000 per project. And cost share is a requirement for this program. Proposers must provide at least 50% of the total project cost or the total design cost that's being for each project proposal. Next slide. So some other funding conditions to highlight, as I mentioned, cost share is a requirement, at least 50% cost share. And cost share includes direct labor, purchase materials, or cash contributions from a co-funder. Contributions of unpaid labor or labor from a municipal official or employee do not qualify as proposer cost share. Projects are limited to one award per funding round. So if a project is being implemented in multiple phases, a single phase can be proposed and awarded through each round. So for example, in round one, phase one of a project could be proposed and awarded, and another phase could be proposed in a subsequent round of this program. But in total, projects may not receive more than 2 total awards. Next slide. So as I mentioned previously, the minimum size threshold for a project with a single building is at least 150,000 square feet of conditioned space. And for multiple building projects, so projects that have at least 2 buildings located on a single property or contiguous properties, must have a minimum of 250,000 square feet of conditioned space. And if a project includes both existing building retrofits and new construction, the way we are distinguishing between existing buildings and new construction incentive thresholds is that if 50% or more of the total conditioned space in the project is new construction, then that project will be limited to the new construction incentive cap of $300,000. Next slide, please. So some information about proposer eligibility. Proposers must consist of team members with experience designing a system of comparable size and complexity. The team must include at least one New York State licensed professional engineer or registered architect. For projects that include geothermal, although not a requirement to include geothermal, we anticipate many will. For geothermal projects, the team must have at least a certified geothermal designer or a prescribed combination of education and experience, which is detailed in the solicitation documentation. So please reference the main summary document for the list of prescribed education and experience that could be used in lieu of a certified geothermal designer on the team. For projects that include multiple buildings, the team should consider including an organization experienced in direct outreach to customers and building owners. Examples include community-based organizations or climate justice advocacy organizations, especially for projects that are located in disadvantaged communities or include low-income housing. A preference will be given in the scoring for projects that include minority-owned and women-owned business enterprises, as well as service-disabled veteran-owned businesses and benefit corporations, as defined in Article 17 of New York State Business Corporation Law. Project proposers that are ineligible for this program include utilities that are subject to the Utility Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act. Next slide. So some minimum qualifications for project eligibility include projects that are located in New York State. So this program opportunity is only available for buildings, single building and multiple building projects that are located within New York. The project must be focused on decarbonization of heating, cooling, and domestic hot water, and must meet the minimum size requirements for both single or multiple building projects, as I mentioned earlier. And a completed feasibility study is a minimum requirement for submission to this program. Additional project requirements include evidence that the thermal resources are adequate for the project. So for a project, for example, for a project that includes geothermal, geotechnical testing or some evidence that demonstrates that that project site is suitable for geothermal heating and cooling must be provided with the proposal or included in the scope. And the project should demonstrate that it is replicable to many other use cases in New York State. Must, throughout the design of the project, it must also adhere to existing codes and standards. Preference will be given to projects that are located in disadvantaged communities or that serve low-income housing, and also projects that more holistically incorporate decarbonization elements such as renewable energy like solar PV or battery electric storage. Some examples of projects that are ineligible for funding through this solicitation are design projects already funded through NYSERDA or a utility program, design projects that have already been completed, and utility thermal energy network pilot projects approved by the Public Service Commission. Next slide. So now I'll walk through some of the proposal, the mechanics of proposing to this program. I'll talk about the elements of a proposal that are required for submission, including the main body of the proposal, which is the technical content, the work plan, the requirements for the budget that must be included with the proposal, as well as some other supporting documentation, like documents that can be included in the appendix, as well as the feasibility study, which is a requirement for submission with a proposal to this program. Next slide. So I won't go through every single bullet in exhaustive detail here, but just to touch on some of the elements that are included in the main proposal document or the proposal technical content include the executive summary, and in the executive summary should be an outline of the team that is proposing to the PON, as well as the buildings that are being served by the large-scale thermal system, as well as whether or not the project is located in a disadvantaged community. The project proposer or the proposer information should include the name or the team member that is a New York State licensed professional engineer or registered architect. Identify who will be signing the contract if the project is awarded funding, and identify the other interests, so building owners, customers, organizations involved in the design project. Next slide. Some other information to be included in the proposal technical content include a project description and benefits, including objectives and benefits of the project. So the improvement in energy efficiency impact either on a disadvantaged community or low-income housing that'll be served by the large-scale thermal system. A description of the project site and the building characteristics, so the types of buildings that will be served, the size of the buildings, the thermal loads, as well as the energy density of the buildings that will be included in the design. Some details about the standalone design, like the types of heat pumps that will be used, whether or not it's a centralized or distributed system, in the event that a thermal energy network is proposed, the types of thermal resources, so whether geothermal, waste heat recovery, other adjunct renewable electricity and battery storage elements that will be included in the design, as well as climate resiliency considerations. In business models, so a clear definition of who will own each element of the system, a life cycle cost analysis, and a preliminary financing approach for if the building were to proceed to construction, as well as a description of customer engagement and protection. Next slide. The proposal technical content must also include the proposer qualifications, so the organizations that are involved, as well as the qualifications of key individuals and any previous experience that would demonstrate capability to perform the design proposed to the solicitation. Next slide. So in addition to the technical content, another document that's required to be submitted with the proposal is the work plan, and the work plan can be created by using attachment A, which is included on the solicitation page. You can download that. That's in a modifiable Word format. We ask that you redline that document, customize it to your project needs, and put in dates for the project milestones and costs associated with each one of the milestone payments. So you can find that template as attachment A on the PON 5614 page. Next slide, please. Along with the technical content and the work plan is a requirement to provide a budget. So there's a spreadsheet called attachment B on the solicitation page. It's an Excel file. You can download that, and you're required to fill out all 4 tabs of that spreadsheet. The first tab requests that you break down labor costs by each team member. The second tab is a request to outline all of the funding sources that will be used to fund this design project, including the requested NYSERDA funding, proposer cost share, and any other co-funder cost share that will be included. The third tab requests that you break out the budget by each project milestone. So those project milestones should align with those in the work plan. And then finally, there's a tab requesting an outline of any other public funding, either pending, awarded, or being sought to support the design project that's proposed to this PON. Next slide. Along with those other documents, there's also a placeholder when you go into Salesforce to submit an appendix, and the appendix can include the documents that are outlined here. So you can include letters of support or commitment from other team members that are part of the project proposal, or building owners of buildings that are being proposed for the large-scale thermal system. The appendix can also include resumes of key team members to demonstrate their capability to support with the design. Project site ownership documentation. So for projects with multiple building sites, the documentation can show who owns each building and their support for the project. If the project is proposing to include low-income housing, so housing that meets the 60%, that is at or below 60% state median income, there are definitions in the solicitation for proxy documents that can be used to demonstrate that the housing qualifies as low-income housing. Also included in the appendix should be the thermal resource testing data. So whether that's geothermal or surface water or wastewater, evidence that the thermal resources being proposed can support the thermal loads in the proposed design, as well as any other additional or supplemental information to support the design proposal. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, a feasibility study is a prerequisite for proposing to this solicitation. So the feasibility study does not necessarily have to have been completed through the prior program, 4614, the Community Heat Pump Systems Program, although feasibility studies completed through that program are eligible, as well as feasibility studies completed through FlexTech or other funding sources, as long as the feasibility studies satisfy the requirements that are defined in attachment C on the PON 5614 solicitation page. Next slide. So proposals to this program will be evaluated by an independent scoring committee. Each proposal must satisfy the minimum proposer and eligibility criteria, some of which I touched on earlier. And then each proposal will be scored according to the criteria defined in this PON. The table below shows some examples, although the exhaustive scoring criteria can be found in the solicitation documentation. The evaluation criteria shown here is just a snapshot of what can be found in that document. The high-level criteria includes marketplace benefits and impacts, such as whether or not the project is scalable or replicable or greatly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, project economics, such as if the cost of the design proposal is reasonable, organization participation and commitment, so demonstrating the capabilities of the proposing team, as well as some other scoring criteria, such as whether or not the proposed project would benefit a disadvantaged community. Next slide. Here's a high-level overview of the proposal process. So as I mentioned, a completed feasibility study is a prerequisite. After a feasibility study is completed that meets the feasibility study requirements defined for the solicitation, a proposal can be submitted with an eligible proposer. A list of potential solution providers is located on the large-scale thermal website. A disclaimer there is that list has not been vetted by NYSERDA. That is a list that of solution providers who have identified themselves as being interested in partnering for a large-scale thermal project, and any proposer or interested project site should do their own vetting to make sure that they are working with a team that meets the eligibility criteria for this program. And then proposers can submit a proposal to this program through the Salesforce portal, including all the documentation that I previously outlined. And then NYSERDA will use an independent scoring committee to review each of the proposals against the scoring criteria defined in the solicitation. And if a proposal is not selected, they may request a debrief, and the strengths and weaknesses that were identified during the review process will be reviewed with the proposer that is not selected through a proposal round. For projects that are selected, funding will be dispersed in milestone payments, and we will have a maximum contract term of 4 years for projects awarded through this solicitation. Next slide. So the first funding, the first round due date for PON 5614 is September 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Proposals are due before that time. Proposals received after 3 p.m. on the 26th will not be reviewed. They will not be eligible for scoring. The second round due date for PON 5614 is January 30th of 2025, so early next year, again at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. All proposals must be submitted through NYSERDA Salesforce portal, the link of which is provided below. And next slide, please. So now we'll open it up to questions and answers, or Q&A.
Sue, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, this is Patrick O'Shaw. I'm going to read some of the questions along with the answers, so just to find the document. So must the project submitted to PON 5614 for design support have participated in PON 4614? The answer is no. So these can be new projects that did not participate in that program. There was a question that I think Sue's already answered. Will a selection criteria scorecard be published identifying the weighting for each criteria? And Sue, yes, the answer is yes. And Sue did go through that. Next question, would an adaptive reuse of an existing building be considered existing or new? So if it is adaptive reuse, meaning going to new code, it would be considered new construction. If it is a rehab, even if extensive, it would be considered a retrofit, and we can go through that, but it really depends on whether it has to be built to current code or whether the grandfathering of the existing code. So it's fairly technical, and you can get us to rule on a specific project separately. Does the feasibility study have to be a flex tech study or PON 5614 study, or can it be independent? Sue did answer that question. It can be independent as long as the study contains essential information about the technology, the energy, and the economics. And we can also, you can reach out to us about that if you have additional questions. Does participation or plans to participate in PON 5547 heat recovery preclude or limit availability of participating in this program? So this program does not allow funding to be commingled with other NYSERDA programs. So you cannot, for the same project, participate in both PON 5547 and 5614. What I would say is this funding is designed for tapping thermal sources that exist outside of the building, and PON 5547 is focused on tapping thermal sources within the building. So they are going after slightly different things, but in any case, you cannot participate in in funding for both for the same project. And then Sue, maybe you can answer, oh, there's more questions came up. So is 100% electrification of heating and hot water required? Related, is combustion or waste heat from combustion allowed to be incorporated if it's a small predetermined percentage? So I do not know the answer to that question. Sue, do you?
100%. We do not require 100% electrification of heating and hot water through this PON.
Okay. And then next question, are customers limited to working with someone on the list of solicitation providers?
The answer to that is no.
Solution providers. Okay.
The answer to that is no. Yeah.
All right. Next, would a subway station be classified as a building or a heat sink source? We would believe that it would be part of a multi-building. So again, on that one, I guess you would have to reach out to us about the specifics. It really depends on definition. The station itself, we would probably consider as we would a building. So, but I don't want to just try to answer that off the cuff based on the little information that's provided there. And then another question: does the proposer for geothermal have to be a CGD, or could they be a PE and include a CGD on the team?
Yes, they could be a PE and include a CGD on the team.
Okay. Oh, all right. Now I got to go down. There's lots of questions. They came on like a rush at the end here. Where can I find attachment C? I do believe that that there is a link if you go to the PON page that you will see a link for attachment C.
That is correct.
Will the slides be available for participants to review?
Yes, the recording of this webinar and the slides will be available.
Yep. Okay. can we provide any more detail on the requirements for the feasibility study? Do we have those laid out specifically in one of the attachments?
We do, yeah. So along with all the other attachments are on the PON 5614 solicitation page, including the itemized list of requirements for a completed feasibility study.
And I would just say, if you have a question that is not covered in there, you can send that to the email address. And we may choose to answer that. If we do answer it, we would answer it for everybody and publish it. Let's see, there are limitations to eligible uses of awarded funds? Example, can be design or construction. This is strictly co-funding of the design of the system. So this is not construction funding. This would be funding for the engineering, the design of the system itself. So I would just say, in this case, no. We haven't written. We did have construction funding in the last PON, but we do not have construction funding in this PON. And then, will a PON 5547 Category 1 suffice? I don't know the answer to that question. I know the basics of PON 5547. I don't think Sue does. So I think we're going to have to get back. We'll have to answer that question in the notes and publish it, but I do not know. All right, a few more questions. They keep coming. Can projects already designed but not yet constructed be granted this award so long as feasibility prior to design is demonstrated? No, these cannot be retroactively applied to work that's already been done. That would be the general case across all of NYSERDA funding, not just this program. If, as a public entity, we need to competitively select our design team, can we only apply once the design team is in place? So, Sue, I mean, that you'd have to interpret the rules, but I don't know them well enough to interpret that question.
Yeah, I would say we'll answer that one in writing, but just in summary, we do define the proposer eligibility criteria in the PON, so the team must consist of those folks at the proposal stage.
I have a question here. If the conditioned area of multiple buildings is slightly less than 250,000 square feet, for example, 243,000 square feet, is there any exception to be eligible?
That is a minimum eligibility. That is a minimum eligibility criteria defined in the PON to be at least 250,000 square feet for multiple building projects.
Yeah, we could check on how you're calculating that, though. That's one of the areas. Will 100% electrification receive a preferred evaluation?
The program aims to award projects that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So whether the strategy that's used to do that will be favorable. The greater the greenhouse gas emission reduction, the more favorably a proposal will be reviewed.
Does NYSERDA have recommendations for New York State agencies following RFQ, RFP consultant selection processes? I believe we're going to have to answer that in writing outside of this webinar. And then let's see, right at question 20. If you are currently designing a new building to include geothermal, can you still apply? Are you eligible?
If that's a question about whether or not new construction buildings are eligible for this pond, then yes.
Yeah, and it might be a question about at what point in, so if we take a new construction project and it's in pre-schematic or schematic design, at what point would you be considered to be beyond the design phase of the project? So I think if that's the nuance of the question, could you please submit a question to us in writing that's more specific, and we'll answer that in writing. Let's see, is there an expectation that a PON for the construction might be coming in the future? Currently, I'm just going to tell you what I know. Currently, we don't have a source of funding for construction costs. We are looking to do that, but I just am not able to provide any assurance that we will be able to do that until we have a funding source. But we currently do not have a funding source to be able to buy down construction at a meaningful rate that would actually help project economics. So we are looking for funding. Let's see. Next question. At what phase of the drawing process could one enter this PON? Design development? Yeah, so this comes back to a good question. So if we go through the traditional design process, so pre-schematic, schematic, it's very basic. This is really intended, I think, to primarily fund design development, what would traditionally be called design development. So again, if you have a specific question about your specific project, submit that to us in writing, and we'll get you an answer. So another question regarding PON 5547. If category 1 of PON 5547 is only feasibility, can the following design work be funded by 5614, assuming no overlap found in the proposed scope of work? So let me just be as clear as I can. You can tap other NYSERDA programs for feasibility work and then apply for this design funding. So we do allow you to tap, for example, Flex Tech, have done feasibility under PON 4614. You could even tap early design funding in new construction and still participate in this PON. So we'll review that and provide a written answer. But in general, if all we've provided is feasibility funding from some other source of NYSERDA, the project could still be eligible for this PON. Can a project that is just beginning design be considered to receive funding, assuming it meets all the requirements? I would assume it, again, it depends on where you are in the design, but I would assume that if you're not earnestly in design development already, that you could be eligible and you can submit specifics about your project. Oh my gosh, it just goes on pages of questions. Following up on this conditioned area question, can the multiple buildings be in 2 different locations as long as it's the same owner? Does it have to be one campus? The PON is written to support one campus and has some flexibility about how you service multiple buildings on a campus. I do not believe, and so I'll defer to you, I do not believe it will qualify as a 2-building project if the 2 buildings are physically in different locations.
Yeah, we define it as on a single property or contiguous property, so adjoining properties if they are if the multiple buildings are to qualify as a multiple building project.
The next question, I'm not sure I understand. I can read the words, but I'm not sure I understand the nuance of the question. Does hydrogen and thermal qualify for this program? And I would ask you to submit a lengthier question to us in writing so that we can answer that. We have two more questions here. If you are currently in the schematic design phase of a project and are including geothermal in the design, is the project still eligible or have we surpassed the limit? I think we'll get back to you in writing just to be clear about this issue, since it's come up in a variety of ways about exactly where we would draw the line. In many cases, the level of design being done in pre-schematic or schematic design is really akin to feasibility studies. So we'll have to define that a little more clearly. And then, Sue, I'm going to give this one to you. Can you go over again? Oh, I can do this. Can you go over again the eligibility for existing buildings versus new construction? So new construction has a lower cap for the incentive. And part of the reason for this is looking at the economics of new construction projects, which already have a budget for designing an HVAC system. And then separately from that, in a retrofit, you not only have to design the HVAC system, but you've got to deal with the existing conditions of the buildings that are being attached. So it's just a more costly project, and that's what our data shows us. For a project that's a mix, we determine which cap to use, whether to use the existing or new construction cap based on the percentage of, is a project 50% or more existing, serving existing, or is it 50% or more serving new construction? That would determine what the cap was. But again, if you have a question about a specific project, you can submit details to us and we can answer that in writing. And then this, I believe, is our last question. If a second structure, subway, wastewater plant, industrial, provides energy to a single building, is this a single or multiple building project? The source building may not have lots of conditioned floor space. So we'll follow up in writing on this one, just to be clear. I think I know the answer, but I'd rather have us just walk through that and give everybody a written answer that we stick with. But because we haven't explicitly talked about we've assumed the source is not a building, so we'll have to talk about that. Question 30, I think we've already answered 100% electrification. So it says there's 100% electrification required. The system does not need to take on the entire thermal load of the building being served. We will judge the project, because this was competitive, based on the displacement of fossil fuel emissions in serving the thermal load, either in comparison to code with a new construction building, or to existing with a retrofit. But it's not required to serve you're not required to electrify 100% of the thermal load in order to qualify for this funding. Well, I think we have it there in terms of the questions, and thank you everybody for attending, and we will follow up with additional questions in writing.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.